You know, I got to be honest. I was thinking through this book the other day, and I thought, it could have just ended with Haman's death. Anybody else feel like that? Like you're going through the chapter by chapter through the book, and you've got a king who just seems to be almost like the dunce of the story. He doesn't make any decisions on his own. He's always relying on other people, and all the decisions he makes seems to be just so extreme. And he kicks his wife Vashti out because she won't appear before him when he calls. He has a beauty pageant where he picks his wife out of all the beautiful virgins in the empire. And so you go through this book and you meet the villain, Haman, right? And Haman is the guy that, because Mordecai will not bow down to him, he gets so angry that he wants to have Mordecai put to death. But he's not content with just Mordecai because he wants to kill all the Jews, right? And it really goes back to a family lineage because Haman is the son of Agag, and Agag is the Amalekite, and the Amalekites have been at war with Israel since they left to go to the promised land, right? Right after they leave Mount Sinai, who do they have conflict with? The Amalekites. And Ken was talking about that this morning with Moses and having to raise his hands up. He was fighting the Amalekites. And Haman is a descendant of Agag, the king of the Amalekites. And so his hatred for the Jews goes back generation and generation. And he's not content with just having Mordecai put to death for not bowing down before him. He wants to have all the Jews put to death, right? And so he's definitely the villain of the story. Somebody who's like, if there's a person that personifies that verse, that God opposes the proud and gives grace to the humble, that's Haman, right? He sits around with his family and talks about how much wealth he has, which, by the way, his family would have known how much wealth they have. They live with them, right? He talks about his many sons and his high status in the kingdom, and all that is not enough to make Haman happy, because as long as that Jew Mordecai is still at the gate, then he cannot be happy, right? That one seed of hatred keeps him from being able to see all the blessings in his life. But God, through his providence, turns things around. And that's what, like, if there's another message that's been coming through in the book of Esther, is that's God's providence, that Esther might have been put here for just a time as this, right? God is working behind the scenes to make his will known. And so Esther rises up, and she has to be willing to risk her own life, to lay her own life down on behalf of her people. Because in order to, when Haman writes the first decree, the first edict to have all the Jews throughout the kingdom annihilated, Esther has to decide to go and approach the king unannounced. A death sentence for anybody who might have done that within the Persian kingdom, but she's willing to do it, which is why Esther stands up as maybe a hero in the faith, right? She's willing to risk her own life on behalf of her people, and she pleads with the king. And that starts, what started in chapter 7 is just one really long day for the king, right? Because in chapter 7, the king can't sleep. Of course he can't sleep because his wife showed up unannounced with a request, and he knows that the request must be something significant, because why would she risk her life if it wasn't? But that wife, sometimes they can just get on your nerves sometimes. She wouldn't tell him what it was that was bothering her. She wouldn't let him know. It's the fact she said, why don't you come to a banquet? And when the king goes to the first banquet, she says, why don't you come to a second banquet? And so the king is up all night just wondering, like, why is she going through so much to just make this petition? He's already promised her that he would give up to half the kingdom, right? Which is just a hyperbolic way of saying, I love you. I'll give you whatever your heart desires. I'll give it to you. On that morning when the king couldn't sleep and he had been up all night. Who's ever had a night like that? I had a night like that last night, right? I just could not sleep last night. And it made for a really bad day today. In fact, January already told me that I might have been grumpy earlier. So if I was grumpy with any of you, I apologize, right? I didn't get a lot of sleep. That's kind of what happens when you don't get a lot of sleep. You're up all night, not knowing why you can't sleep, and then you wake up the next day, or you don't wake up the next day, you just get up the next day, and you're a little grumpy. And then after all that, the king shows up, maybe tired, at this second banquet of Esther, and he's patient throughout dinner, just waiting and waiting for her to make her request. And finally, when the wine is served, he can't take it anymore, and he asks Esther, what is it that what is your request? What is your petition? I'll give you up to half the kingdom. And Esther finally makes her request. She says, my request is for my own life. My petition is for my people, right? And then she blames it all on that wicked Haman, which she had to do because you wouldn't want the king to think that he might have some blame on it, right? I mean, it was after all his signet ring that sent out the edict in the first place, but she can't imply that the king is complicit in this decree. So she says it's that evil Haman that did this, right? King gets so angry, he storms out into the garden. Who knows why? But when he comes in, he sees Haman begging at the feet of Esther for his life, pleading for his life. The king sees it and interprets it as he's taking advantage of the queen while she's in the room. And so he has Haman impaled on the very same pole that Haman had set up for Mordecai. Like, God just turns these things around. Now, I honestly thought, like, okay, if that was the end of the story, it'd be good, right? Like, we could move on to another chapter or another book. It would be like Haman's gone. The villain is no more. But who thinks that's the end of the story? No, there's 2 more chapters in front of us, right? So obviously it's not the end of the story. And there's a good reason there's still 2 chapters. Because even though Haman is gone, his evil decree is still around, isn't it? It's just not gone. And so in chapter 8, that's what it has to be dealt with. So we're in Esther chapter 8, and it's this very same day. That's why I said this is a really long day for the king. Can't sleep at night, up all night wondering. Then he's at a banquet. Then he finds out his second in command has betrayed him. And now it's the very same day, and he's got to take care of some things. And so it says, that same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. And the crowd goes wild, right? Because it seems almost like, okay, like this is all done with. The king has done what he can do to take care of the problem. But of course that's not true, because just because Haman is gone, his evil decree is still right there. And so Esther has to seize the day, right? She's got to take care of this while it's still fresh. And so she pleads a second time to the king. And that's what happens in the next section, right? In verse 3, Esther pleaded again. And it's a very personal plea. She falls down at the feet of the king, and she begs him. And she uses all these if clauses, like, if I please you, and if I have found favor with you, and if it sounds good to you, maybe you could rescue us from this evil decree. Let's read it real quick. What she says. It says in verse 5, right? After the king invites her back, it says, Esther pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping, she began. I'm going to jump to verse 5. If it pleases the king, she said, and if he regards me with favor and thinks it right thing to do, and if he is pleased with me, let an order be written to overruling the dispatches that Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews and all the king's providences. For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see destruction on my family? You see how Esther is really identifying with the people of Israel? Like, how is she supposed to live if she sees her family, her people destroyed? Now, remember that king, the first time that Esther pleaded? She said, she came before the king, and the king seemed very generous. He said, I'll give you half of my kingdom. Remember that? See, there's a problem. Now what Esther is asking for is impossible. Because as we remember from chapter 1, once a decree has been established, no one, not even the king, can overturn it. And so he might be talking a big game, like, yes, I'll give you up to half of my kingdom, but in reality, he can't even turn over his own decree. He'll say that, right? He'll tell us again whenever he replies to Esther. He reminds her of everything that he has done already. In verse 7, it says, King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther, and they have impaled him on the pole he has set up. Now write another decree in the king's name in behalf of the Jews, as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring, for no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked. See, the king cannot overturn, he cannot change, he cannot even do away with that first edict. because it was written in the king's name. The only thing that he can do is write a counter decree that hopes to curb the effects of the first decree. And so that's what he has Mordecai do. They set out to do it just then, and they go to write the decree. In verse 9, it says, "At once all the royal secretaries were summoned. On the 23rd day of the third month, the month of Sivan, they wrote out all of Mordecai's orders to the Jews and to the satraps and governors and to the nobles of the 127 provinces stretching from India to Cush. These orders were written in the script of each province and language of each people, and also of the Jews in their own script and language." Doesn't verse 9 seem like a long verse? It is the longest verse in the Bible, by the way. So that makes sense why it's the long verse. But did you see the governors, the satraps, and all these people come together to write a counter decree, and it tells us when. It tells us they did it on the third month, the month of Sivan, which is 70 days after the first edict was written. Now, maybe that means something to you. 70 is a pretty important number. How many people know how long the people of Israel were stuck in exile? 70 years, right? And just after the decree was issued, 70 days later, a counter decree was issued rescuing the people of Israel. Now, the way that the decree sounds is very much like the first decree. In fact, you can read I believe it's chapter 5, and read Haman's first decree, and then read this chapter and read Mordecai's decree, and it's almost word for word the same language. The only difference is this decree allows the Jews to defend themselves. Now, they can't go out and take vengeance. They can't go out and destroy. All they can do is it gives them the right to assemble together, kind of like we are today. Assemble together. And if anybody tries to attack them, they then have the right to defend themselves and to plunder anybody who tries to plunder them. Right? Now, it does say anybody who tries to attack their men, women, and children. So this counter decree, again, is not giving them the right to go out and take vengeance. It's only giving them the right to defend themselves and to plunder those who plunder them. And when you read the next chapter, one of the interesting things about the next chapter is the Jews do not plunder anyone. They don't kill any women or children. They only defend themselves against those who go after to destroy them. And it'll be an interesting chapter in 2 weeks when we go through that. See, God turns this whole thing around. The counter decree goes out, and now instead of fasting, the Jews are feasting and full of joy, right? In fact, in verse 15, it says, "When Mordecai left the king's presence, he was wearing a royal garment of blue and white, a large crown of gold and purple robe, fine linen, and the city of Susa held a joyous celebration for the Jews. It was a time of happiness and joy, gladness and honor." Do you guys see how God turned the whole thing around? Chapter 8 is about God turning things around. It's a time of happiness and honor. In every province and in every city which the edict came, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebrating, and many people and other nationalities became Jews because the fear of the Jews had seized them. This is kind of giving us a key into why the book of Esther is read during Purim. It's a time of joy and celebration. Who likes feasting? Come on, you guys go to church. You have to like feasting. That's what we do. When we meet, we eat, right? And so that's what Esther's about, is a celebration that God in his providence protected his people. And so that's chapter 8. We have a couple things I want to talk about in chapter 8, mostly like centered around that decree that can't be overturned. And my first point is that Haman is gone, but his decree lives on. Right? Haman is gone, but his decree lives on. This is a really important thing, because sometimes we think we're done fighting, right? We're done working because the person that we were trying to oppose is no longer there. In fact, Esther may have thought that. She at first may have thought, my life is spared. I'm safe. The king knows I'm a Jew. He's not going to let anybody hurt me. I can be done. Mordecai could have thought the same thing. Like, now he's second in command. He's got the king's signet ring, a purple robe, and a gold crown. He can be done. And Haman is dead. He's definitely done. But the effects of the law that he put into place is still part of the Persian law. I think we see this a lot in our own society. We see the effects of laws, right? That maybe they are ancient laws. And thank God we live in a society that can overturn these laws. But there are plenty of laws that have sin written into them, aren't there? And we can't, as people living in this society, we might have no power to do anything about those laws except for maybe go out and vote, right? But we can do things to counter the effects of those laws. So when I was thinking about this point, I was thinking about the Jim Crow laws of the South, right? You guys know what they are, right? The laws that allowed segregation within southern states. Now, would you guys say those were good laws? No. In fact, people stood opposed to those laws where they could, to counter the effects of those laws where they could. And that's us today, because we are living in a society that there are some things that are written into the law that we can't overturn, but we can work within our society, within our community, to counter the effects of those laws. And that's what Mordecai and Esther do. They can't change the law, but they can work to counter the effects of the law. See, even if you're not talking about the actual law, you're just looking at the effects of sin. I'm somebody who struggles, not me personally struggling with poverty, but I look at poverty and I think, gosh, there's a lot of injustice that happens in our world. I can't do anything to change it, but can I work to counter it? You guys should say yes, right? We can do what we can to counter the effects of those laws, of the effects of those decrees. And that's the first thing that I think we have to point out. Haman's evil decree was written into the system itself. Can't change it, but you can counter it. And that's what Esther does. My second point is that the gospel is God's counter decree. The gospel is God's counter decree. See, one of the interesting things about this chapter is the first decree, Haman's wicked decree, that's signed by his own signet ring, right? It's the king's signet ring that signed it. It's also the king's signet ring that signed Mordecai's decree on behalf of the Jews. The same king signed that ring, that decree. His ring sealed both decrees. And I was thinking about that because, well, you know, it seems foolish. A king who can't overrule or overturn his own laws. It seems foolish in our time, but of course we're not trying to prop a king up to be a deity, right? So that's why this rule is in effect anyway, because the king obviously can't make any mistakes, or he might not be king. So this law is there so that the king can't. No one can say the king was wrong. He's always right, and even if he writes something that's wrong, he just can only counter it. I guess my point is that the king in this story is kind of a puppet king. He makes all these mistakes, but there is a decree that God gave us that cannot be overturned. It's in Genesis chapter 2, actually, and we can read it, right? This is God's decree. It can't be overturned. And by the way, we shouldn't want to overturn it. Here's what it says in Genesis chapter 2, verse 15. It says, "The Lord God took the man and put him in the garden to work and to take care of it. And the Lord commanded the man, 'You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat it, you will certainly die.'" Do you guys see the first decree? The day you eat of this tree, you're going to certainly die. And well, you guys know the story. They took from the tree. It looked so tasty to Eve, right? It looked good for knowledge and for gaining wisdom. So she sees it, she wants it, she takes it, they eat it. And sin enters the world, and the wages of sin is death. That's just the decree. You can't counter that. You can't overturn that. That's God's command, his law, right? The wages of sin is death. But you know, from the time that they sinned in the garden, God began working with the counter decree. He told them the son of woman is going to crush the serpent's head. He told Abraham, "From your offsprings, all nations on earth will be blessed." He told Moses that there's going to be a prophet like you. He told David that your son is going to remain on the throne forever. right? We're promised the root and the offspring of David will come. And then Jesus does come, right? And he comes, and when he comes, he tells us his mission. We all know this verse. I'm going to read it anyway. John 3:16. This isn't his only mission statement, but it's what he's talking about when he says why God sent him in the first place. He said this, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, for whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life." See, the wages of sin is death, but God's counter decree, if you accept Jesus, whoever believes and accepts Jesus shall not perish, but have eternal life. That's God's counter decree. He says this in verse 17, For God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. Right? It's God's counter decree to save the world, because obviously the wages of sin is death, and God is a God of justice. But he's also a God of mercy and compassion, right? That's how he describes himself in Exodus 37. A God full of compassion, abounding in love. And we were talking about this in the Monday night Bible study on Jonah, but for God to be compassionate means that he has to be willing or able to change, right? To change his mind about certain things. Because he's responding to the people, and he wanted to. Yeah, well, we're not studying Jonah tonight, so I'm going to move past that, right? My point is that God is full of compassion, and although he is a God of justice, the wages of sin is death. Once man broke that law, the counter decree began. And that counter decree ended with Jesus, ascended to heaven. This Jesus whom you crucified is both Lord and Messiah. And we live in that time that Joel talks about, that anyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. My third point is the gospel. The gospel turns things around. The gospel turns things around. So the gospel is God's counter decree, and it turns things around. You see a few examples in the story of Esther, of God turning things around. In fact, that's what the latter half of the book is really all about. But let's just look at some examples of what God turned around in this chapter, right? Starting in verse 1 of chapter 8, the King Xerxes gave Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came into the presence of the king, and Esther told how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which was reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. All those things that Haman was so proud about, his wealth, his children, his status. Who has it all now? Mordecai. Because God opposes the proud and he gives grace to the humble. That's not all that God turned around. When the first decree goes out, everybody in the city is bewildered. That's what the text says. The king and Haman drink wine, and everybody in the town, the city of Susa, or the citadel of Susa, is bewildered. When the second decree goes out, it's in verse 17, in every province, in every city to which the edict of the king came, there was joy and gladness. Right? It goes from everybody bewildered to joy and gladness. The Jews, when they heard the first decree, they tore their clothes, sackcloth, ashes, fasting. Now, they're feasting because God turns things around. See, that's what God's counter decree does. It turns things around. Mordecai is probably the best example. He goes from sackcloth to a purple robe and a gold crown. God turns things around. That's what the gospel does. Right? John the Baptist, the one that was preparing the way for the Lord. Right? He talks about what is he coming to do? What is his mission? And he quotes from Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3 through 5. And just as I read this text, Just see how God flips things around, how he makes the mountains low and the valleys high. Here's what it says. A voice of one calling in the wilderness prepares the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for God. Every valley shall be raised up, every mountain and hill made low, and the rough ground shall become level, the rugged places a plain, and the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all people will see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. John the Baptist began to preach this message because when Jesus comes, he comes to turn things around, to bring the mountains low, the valleys high, the rugged place into the plain. I think the best example of that, of course, is Jesus himself, who in his very nature was God, but didn't consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage, but made himself nothing, taking on the image of a servant and being found in human likeness. God turned it around, right? He gave him the name that was above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. The gospel turns things around. So at this chapter, it would have been easy, I really think it would have been easy to stop in chapter 7 because the enemy is dead. He's been impaled. But just because the enemy is dead, his law is still on the books. You can't overturn it. You can only write a counter decree. And you can only work to curb the effects of that first one. And that's what God did. His first decree, the wages of sin is death. But God, through the gospel, offers a counter decree. Accept Jesus and you'll find life. I was thinking of how to conclude this sermon. I just think that we should ask ourselves, what decree are we advocating for? Are we working on the counter decree to bring life into a world that's destined for death? So that's what Jesus called us to do. Go into the world and preach the gospel to all nations. We are people who should be working with that counter decree, trying to make the mountains low and the rugged places a plain. We're going to sing a song of invitation. If you're looking for a church or a church home, we'd invite you to come to this one, to make this church your church family. We're a church that believes the Bible and values each other. And encourages each other. So if you're looking for a church, we invite you to come forward as we sing number 915 in the hymnal.